Shalom, once again, invitation to Exodus. Wow, I received so many responses to our first lesson, and thank you very much for all the encouragement. And now we're on to a second lesson. We're still not going to be diving into chapter 1 today, but we will be finishing our introduction to the book, I hope, today, because it's very important. Before we dive into the book, we have to know the structure of the book, and we'll see, we'll try to get a really bird's eye view on the entire book so that we can start teaching. Last time we spoke, we divided the book into the story of the Exodus. We spoke about the receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. We spoke about the building of the tabernacle, and we said that this is the story of let my people go and they will worship me. And at the same time, we spoke about God being, and I will be for them their God. The two-way relationship between people of Israel and the God of Israel. Today I want to do a new perspective of the whole book. I want to get us to understand the geographical structure of the book and the chronological structure of the book. So we should know it. Very often in the reading the books of the Bible, we don't realize that some chapters can take a day or two. Sometimes we have a chapter that can go for 100 years, and sometimes we'll be reading 4 or 5, 6 chapters, and then they're all in a very short period. So it's important to know the geographical borders of the book, the chronological borders of the book, to get a deeper understanding and a wider perspective on studying of the book. So let's begin with the geography. If I were to divide the book of Exodus to 2 parts, or to, I'd say 3 parts, I would actually, the picture that I would draw would be something I would say like this. We would have 1, 2, 3. What do I mean? 1, 2, 3. What is the 1, 2, 3? We're beginning, if we begin, we are beginning here. We're beginning here in Egypt. The first part of the book of Exodus takes place in Egypt. The final part of the book of Exodus, where does the final part of the book of Exodus take place? I would not only say the final part, the mass majority of the book, where is it taking place? One place. Mount Sinai. The first half of the book is in Egypt. The second half of the book is in Sinai. What happens over here? What happens over here? Here we're talking about the way. The way from Egypt to Mount Sinai. This is the whole division, the geographical division of the book of Exodus. The beginning is in Egypt. The end, from chapter 19, is in Mount Sinai. And in the middle we have the way. But let's just try to remember a little bit more accurately what I just said. The book of Exodus, as I said, we're beginning in Egypt and we're concluding in Sinai. Where in the book of Exodus do the people go out to the journey and leave Mount Sinai? Where in the book of Exodus do the people of Israel leave Mount Sinai? It's a very quick. I would say it's really not a fair question. It's a cruel question, because the answer is, of course, in the book of Exodus, the people of Israel do not leave Sinai. They only leave Sinai in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, as it says right over there, and God speaks to Moses, and he tells them, and the Israelites set out on their journey. I'm talking about Numbers chapter 10, verse 12, and the Israelites set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sinai. The cloud came to rest in the wilderness of Paran. So that in the book of Exodus, the people come to Mount Sinai. Where do they come to Mount Sinai? In chapter 19. Chapter 19, the people of Israel have arrived at Sinai. Let's listen to what it says. Chapter 19 begins from the very beginning of chapter 19. On the third month, it usually means the first day of the third month. On the third month, on the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered the wilderness of Sinai. So the beginning of chapter 19, they arrive at Sinai. And they are remaining at Sinai until the end of the book of Exodus, throughout the entire book of Leviticus, all the way till chapter 10 of the book of Numbers. Now listen carefully. How long? Let's go to the chronology. How long does this book take place? Let me just remind you the pace of the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, the first 11 chapters, which deal about the creation and the stories of the nations, they were talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years. From Abraham's call in the chapter 12, it takes hundreds of years. Abraham lives 175 years. Isaac lives 180 years. Jacob lives 147 years. Joseph lives 110 years. So we're talking about hundreds of years. Then comes the book of Exodus. We said it talks about the people of Israel being in Egypt, and it talks about the people of Israel in Sinai. How long is the whole process? So let's see. How long is the process described about the people in Sinai? We'll go back to the story of Egypt. The people of Israel in Sinai. We said in chapter 19 they arrive at Sinai. And in chapter 40 of Exodus, which the people are still at Sinai, what happens in chapter 40? The final establishment of the tabernacle. When is that? Let's see chronology. The book of Exodus concludes in chapter 40, in verse 17, but also in verse 1. It says, on the first day of the first month, on the first day of the first month, the tabernacle was set up. So we're talking about the first month of the second year. When did they arrive at Sinai? We said the first day of the third month in the first year. So from chapter 19 till chapter 40, we are actually a period of 10 months. From the first of the third month all the way to the first of the first month of the following year. So that's the story of Exodus. How long were they in Mount Sinai? From the establishment of the tabernacle until they began the journey. So let's read. We'll go to chapter 10 in the book of Numbers, and we'll see when did they leave Sinai. It says very clearly in Numbers chapter 10, and it was on the second year, on the 20th day of the second month. So we say like this. They arrive at Sinai on the first of the third month of the first year. First, third month, first year. They finish the tabernacle on the first of the first month of the second year. And they leave the Sinai on the 20th of the second month of the second year. So there are 50 days from the establishment of the tabernacle until they leave Sinai. Again, 10 months from arriving at Sinai to the establishment of the tabernacle, 50 days from the establishment of the tabernacle until going out to the journey of the desert. So let's see where we are. Sinai, we said, they arrive at Sinai on the 1st of month 3, and they on the 1st of month 1, second year, they establish the tabernacle. This is tabernacle. This is arrive at Sinai. Leave Sinai is on the 20th of second month, second year. Let's just show you what I wrote here so we can see. They arrive at Sinai. They arrive at Sinai on the first of the third month of the first year. They conclude the tabernacle on the first of the first month of the second year. And they leave Sinai on the 20th day of the second month of the second year. 50 days. So 10 months from the arrival at Sinai until the tabernacle is established, and 50 days from the establishment of the tabernacle until they leave Sinai. What about Egypt? So we know that the people of Israel were in Egypt for several centuries. But the story of the slavery in Egypt goes on for hundreds of years. We're not going to talk about exactly how long, but the Torah says 400 years. Well, we'll talk about that when we get to the verse of the Torah. But that is spoken about only in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus. Chapter 1 of the book of Exodus talks about the slavery, and that we'll talk about in the next lesson. Chapter 2 of Exodus talks about the birth of Moses, and he has to run away to Midian after he kills the Egyptian. We'll talk about that when we get to there. But we can see that the beginning of the call of Moses to go take the people of Israel out of Egypt, it takes place in the 3rd chapter. And it says later on that when Moses stands in front of Pharaoh, he is 80 years old. He's 80 years old. And at the end of the 40 years in the desert, he's 120 years old. So, if the journey in the desert begins on the beginning of the 2nd year, so actually, from the revelation of God to Moses, in chapter 3, until the exodus from Egypt, it's just a matter of a few months. Just a matter of a few months. He's in his 80th year, and he's called upon God to go to Pharaoh. So the entire book of Exodus, actually, the 1st chapter deals with hundreds of years in slavery. The 2nd chapter seems like it talks about the first years of Moses from when he's born until he's grown up. Maybe he's 20, let's say 20. Then for 60 years he's way out in Midian with his wife Zipporah and his father-in-law Yitro. From chapter 3 until the Exodus is a few months. From the Exodus, which takes place on the 15th day of the first month. The 15th day of the first month is the Exodus. Exodus is the 15th day of month 1. 15th day of month 1 is the Exodus. The first day of the first month of the 2nd year is the establishment of the tabernacle. So actually, from chapter 3 of the book of Exodus till the end of the book of Exodus, we're actually dealing with a little less than a year. I mean, let's put it this way. From the Exodus itself to the end of the book, we're actually dealing with, from the 15th day of the first month till the first of the first month, less than a year. The entire book of Exodus is dealing mostly with 1 year. The Exodus from Egypt, a few months before the plagues, from the Exodus until the establishment of the tabernacle. So what we saw so far right now in the book of Exodus, and it's important to know that the book of Exodus begins with the slavery in Egypt. It's divided to story taking place in Egypt, story taking place at Sinai, and the way. In the way, we have the tearing of the Red Sea, we have the receiving of the Torah. At Sinai, that takes place at Sinai. But we have the fight with Amalek, and a few stories with the water, but those are the stories of the way. Now listen carefully. We saw that the leaving from Sinai takes place in Numbers. The arrival to Egypt takes place in the book of Genesis, chapter 46. The family of Jacob moved down to Egypt in Genesis 46. So actually, if we said that the book of Exodus takes place in Egypt and in Sinai, but the arrival to Egypt is way before, it's already in Genesis. The leaving from Sinai is somewhere in the middle of Numbers. So what is the concept of the book of Exodus? Why is the division? Maybe if you wanted the whole story of Egypt and Sinai, we could have began from somewhere in Genesis 46 and concluded in Numbers 10. But the Torah devotes an entire book not over there. So what is the Torah doing with the book of Exodus? What are we studying here in the book of Exodus? And the answer is very interesting. The answer is the Torah in the beginning of Exodus does not begin from the arrival to Egypt, but it begins in the deepness of the darkness of the slavery. And it concludes not from the leaving of Sinai, but it concludes with the building of the tabernacle. But that's not only that. The story of the darkness begins in chapter 1. Chapter 2, we start seeing a beginning of something. What do we see? Now we have a problem that when we read the book, we know the end, so we're not as excited. We don't need, just like we don't cry about the slavery, and we'll talk about it next time. We also don't know that we know the end, that Moses is going to be saved. So we're not in the tense of what's going to happen. But when reading chapter 2, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when Moses is put in that little box, what's going to be at the end with him. We don't know after he runs away to Midian what's going to be the end there. But we do know a few things. Chapter 2, we see, after the darkness of chapter 1, something's beginning. What is beginning? Let's listen carefully to a few parts of chapter 2. Words that we don't see in chapter 1 for sure. A certain man married a woman. A little bit of romantics. The woman conceived and bore a son. She hid him because she saw how beautiful he was. Something's happening. Something humane is happening. She tried to hide him. She couldn't hide him no longer. So she put the child and placed him in the reeds. And his sisters watched to see what's going to happen, what's going to befall upon him. And the daughter of Pharaoh, she opened the box and she had pity. We see so many things are happening. Humanity, even in these times of darkness, there are humane feelings that are waking up amongst people. And the beginning of redemption can only begin when the wakening up of the emotions from inside can begin. But that's not enough. The emotions, the humane emotions are happening, and they are definitely quieting things up, or making things begin. But there's one more thing. And the one more thing is chapter 3. In chapter 3, Moses is walking in the desert. And suddenly he sees the bush on fire, and it's not burning. What does that mean? The bush on fire and it's not working. It's not burning. We all know that in order for a fire to take place, we need somebody to light the fire, we need oxygen, and we need combustible material. Fire needs to eat all the time, to eat and eat and eat and eat. If it's not eating something, it dies. Now what's happening? Moses sees there's a fire that's not behaving naturally. It's not burning anything. There's no combustible material. It's a godly fire. Moses had never spoken to God before. This was his first moment of revelation. So redemption from the darkness begins first with humane activities. Caring, daughter of Pharaoh, caring. Then Moses paying attention to the revelation, to the holiness of the place. Just like the fire didn't eat the bush, Moses later on, when he gets the revelation on Sinai, he's there 40 days, and he doesn't eat. And he's also not behaving over there in times of revelation in a natural way. Then the glory of God comes down, rests amongst the people all the way till the glory of God, which appears on fire on Sinai, rests finally at the end of the book of Exodus in the tabernacle. And this is where the end of the book of Exodus takes place. The book of Exodus begins with the darkness of darkness. This is the exposition of the book. From there, we're beginning the process of redemption until revelation and the glory of God upon us. As we learn the word of Hebrew. The word of Hebrew, in Hebrew, the word galut means exile, galut. The word for revelation is hitgalut, and the word for redemption is geula. Galut, geula. To arrive from exile to redemption, we go through hitgalut, revelation. And we also go through exposure of human behavior. All of these take place in the book of Exodus. We will start, finally, dealing with the darkness of the Exodus next time. But one more point I wanted to point out. When Abraham is called upon by God, and God promises him descendants and the land, and suddenly he has problems having descendants. He has problems with the land. There's a hunger, famine. He has to go out to Egypt. But God just promised him everything will be okay. No. From the moment God promises until it happens, it doesn't have to happen right away. So too, in chapter 3 and 4, when God calls upon Moses and tells him, go to the people. At first, things are getting harder. But the faith of the people who have faith in God, the humane behaviors, the revelation, and the faith in God take us to overcome the fact that the redemption doesn't begin right away, but eventually it takes place. The holiness of God, the glory of God, rests on the Mount of Sinai, and from there, it's on the journey through the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is the carrying of the glory of God from Sinai to the journey to Israel. The journey of Israel was supposed to go for 11 days, as we see in the book of Deuteronomy, but it took a longer time. But the entire time, the glory of God was amongst the people in the tabernacle. Shalom once again from Israel, from Jerusalem. We're inviting you to share the study course with others, invite people to join us on the invitation to Exodus. And I'm also inviting you all. It's now close to the end of the year. It's perfect timing to partner with the Shalom Jerusalem Foundation and Amitzim to bring about the process of redemption. So go into shalomjerusalem.org and partner with us. And let's bring about Zionism next generation. Shalom from Jerusalem.